Last week, we talked about the NFL and their use of race norming that discriminated against black former players. Tonight, we talk about a similar practice within the criminal legal system, specifically in death penalty cases that discriminates against black and brown defendants. It's unconstitutional to execute someone who's intellectually disabled. Unfortunately, the U.S. has not only executed innocent people, but those who were intellectually disabled due to false diagnoses and ethnic adjustments, a practice that boosted a black or Latino defendant's IQ scores for perceived racial bias in testing. Here to discuss this tonight is Elizabeth Bruenig from The Atlantic. She wrote a compelling piece for the New York Times about Corey Johnson, a black man who recently was executed despite strong evidence of an intellectual disability. Thank you so much for being here tonight. So much, Elizabeth, for being here.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so your article in the Times entitled "When an IQ Score is a Death Sentence" really brought home the point that intellectual disability is a condition, not a score, which has largely been the basis for who gets a death sentence. Corey Johnson was one of them who was executed by lethal injection on January 14th of this year. Can you tell us about his case and what drew you to his story?
Corey Johnson was involved in several homicides in which he had several co-defendants who were also convicted in the same homicides, some of whom have been executed and some of whom have not at this point. So there's an obvious level of unfairness there, which interested me right off the bat. But what was really fascinating to me about Corey was some of the experts in his case were world-renowned experts, such as Greg Ollie in intellectual disability. These are world-famous physicians who are practicing clinicians, who are researchers, who give international lectures, and not a single person I spoke to who had worked with Corey had any doubt that he was intellectually disabled, except for the original clinician who had evaluated him in his original trial. This original clinician was not specialized in intellectual disability. He had not gone into the evaluation with intellectual disability in mind. In fact, he was specialized in violent youth offenders. Corey was not underage. And because Corey had been scored on the border, a borderline score, and this clinician had not made a Flynn adjustment, which is a different thing than a so-called race norming or an ethnic adjustment. This clinician had come to the conclusion that there was no way Corey was intellectually disabled. And in the view of a lot of other experts who reviewed that case file, that was just an incorrect diagnosis, and it should have been unconstitutional to put him to death. But the Trump administration did it anyway.
Now, many people heard the term race norming for the first time last week concerning the NFL's use of that practice that assumed black players had a lower cognitive function than white players. So this essentially made it impossible for black ex-players to prove cognitive impairment, thereby making them ineligible to qualify for a monetary award. Now, a similar practice exists in death penalty cases called, you just mentioned it, ethnic adjustments. I went into it briefly, but can you explain how it works and its impact on black and brown defendants?
Right. So, there are lots of different IQ tests, and they're just scoring instruments for intelligence. So you take the test, and the clinician, whoever administered the test, is going to look at not only the answers that you got, but the time it took you to get them, and they're going to come up with a numerical score. The idea behind so-called ethnic adjustments to those IQ tests is that in whole populations, if you look at entire population average scores of white test takers and the entire population scores of black test takers, you see differences. So you'll see higher average scores in the entire population of white test takers, higher and lower average scores in the entire population of black test takers. There are a lot of theories as to why that is, right? Different levels of education, environmental pollutants like lead, different time periods in which these different groups are tested. No one knows for sure why these different averages show up. What we do know is that they are population level averages. They do not directly compare individuals. However, some people, some persons who represent themselves as experts, let's say, mostly prosecutors, feel like because there are these population level differences, they can therefore adjust an individual's IQ score based on their ethnic group. So if a Black defendant comes up with an IQ score, let's say, of 70, and the Supreme Court says anything in about a 70-75 range is going to be considered intellectually disabled, that's a person that we can't put to death under Atkins, which is a Supreme Court case, then the prosecutor will say, well, on average, the Black population is going to score, 6 points lower than a white population. So we can actually just adjust that 6 points up to adjust for race differences. Therefore, really, his IQ score is not 70, it's 76. Therefore, we can put him to death. There's no scientific basis for this. A lot of times, these numbers that account for ethnic adjustments are just pulled out of hats because there are lots of different population level studies that come up with different aggregate disparities between these populations. And so you have different prosecutors who have made all kinds of different ethnic adjustments over time. You've had people disbarred over this issue.
As they should be. So they're assuming that Black people test lower on IQ tests than white people. And so what they do is they go upwards in order to justify killing Black people. Is that correct?
That's right. So they're saying because on the population level, there's a disparity, we can adjust individual test scores to account for that population level disparity. It doesn't make a huge amount of sense. The scientific reasoning is very spurious, the legal reasoning even more so, but it has allowed prosecutors to get away with these unconstitutional executions.
Now, are there other issues with using IQ as a measure of intellectual disability?
Yeah, I mean, intellectual disability, it's a condition. It's something that people experience in a lot of very different ways. And just like there are a lot of different ways for someone to exhibit intelligence, right? There are a lot of different ways someone can be smart. There are a lot of different ways somebody can struggle. And an IQ test is just one element. It's a single instrument that tells you, gives you a sign that somebody is struggling in a certain way cognitively. But there's also adaptive functioning. That's the other half of it. And that is how somebody's getting along in the world, how they are taking care of themselves or struggling to take care of themselves, how they're getting along in school or struggling to get along in school, how they are conversationally. There are a lot of different ways to know if somebody is struggling. Ultimately, I think of IQ as a clinical tool that helps doctors understand how someone is getting along relative to the population as a whole. I do not think it should be used as a way to exclude someone from a settlement if they have other signs of struggling from traumatic brain injury, as in the NFL. I certainly don't think that these numbers should be played with or abused to put people with intellectual disabilities to death.
Now, Elizabeth, are there any other cases like Corey Johnson? I mean, we obviously know that there have been people that have been put to death that have been intellectually disabled. How is the system trying to reconcile these disparities?
The criminal justice system is not set up to figure out who is intellectually disabled. It is not capable of doing that. There is not a universal healthcare system in place, so it's not as though everyone in society ever has the opportunity to see a developmental specialist or a psychologist who is specialized in detecting developmental disabilities, intellectual disability. By the time that defendants reach the stage where they are seeing, say, a psychologist because they're facing a capital charge, there's no guarantee that their public defender, in many cases, is going to have the wherewithal or the knowledge or the capacity to bring in a well-trained psychologist who has a good deal of experience in intellectual disability. And guess what? If that public defender does not bring in an expert, that's not the criminal justice system's problem. If they bring in someone who doesn't know what they're doing, then appeals counsel can do it later down the line, but it's almost impossible to get new evidence in once you're in the appeals process in a capital case. So at that point, the person is in a lot of trouble. And so I think it's very clear we have put intellectually disabled people to death. There is a running list, about 70-something people long, of intellectually disabled people we've exonerated, which gives you a sense of how many we probably haven't exonerated. And I fully believe that there are intellectually disabled people on death row right now, and that as long as we continue executing people, we will be putting people with mental handicaps to death.
All right, Elizabeth Bruenig, staff writer for The Atlantic. Thank you so very much for your incredible insight onto this issue. Looking forward to having you back. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.